Li Jinho had been cleaning the same corridor for 3 years now. Every morning at 6 sharp, he would put on his grey maintenance uniform, grab his cleaning supplies, and start his rounds on the trading ship Starwind. The work was simple, but important, keeping the massive vessel spotless as it carried cargo and passengers between distant worlds. Today felt different, though. As Jinho pushed his mop bucket down the main hallway, he could hear loud voices coming from the cantina. The ship's dining area was usually quiet during the day shift, but now it sounded like a crowd had gathered. He tried to ignore it and focus on his work, but the voices kept getting louder. The cantina was packed when he finally reached it. Aliens from all over the galaxy sat at the metal tables. Some he recognized as regular traders, others looked like diplomats in fancy clothes, and a few wore the rough gear of mercenaries. But all eyes were focused on one table in the center of the room. Thanica dominated the space around her. The Vektari warrior stood almost 8 feet tall, her purple scales catching the artificial light. 4 powerful arms extended from her massive torso, each one thick with muscle that could crush steel. Her people were famous across the galaxy as unstoppable fighters who had conquered dozens of worlds. Most species gave them a wide berth, and for good reason. Right now, Thanica looked angry. Her crimson eyes burned with contempt as she spoke to the crowd around her. "Look at them," she said, gesturing toward a group of human traders in the corner. Soft little creatures who think they belong in the Galactic Council. Pathetic. Jinho kept mopping, trying to stay invisible. He had heard this kind of talk before. Many alien species resented humanity's recent acceptance into the Council, the governing body that regulated trade and politics across known space. Some said humans had bought their way in with promises of technology and resources, rather than earning respect through strength. "Humans," Thanica continued, her voice getting louder. She slammed one of her 6-fingered fists down on the table, so hard it cracked. The sound echoed through the cantina like a gunshot. Weaklings who hide behind machines and credits instead of facing their enemies with honor. No warrior spirit at all. The other aliens shifted uncomfortably. A few nodded in agreement while others looked nervous. Nobody wanted to get on the wrong side of a Vektari warrior, especially not Thanica. She was known throughout this sector as someone who had never lost a fight. Jinho tried to move past the crowd, but his mop bucket caught on a chair leg. The scraping sound made everyone turn to look at him. Suddenly he found himself the center of attention, with dozens of alien eyes staring at his simple maintenance uniform and cleaning equipment. Thanica's gaze locked onto him like a predator spotting prey. Her scales rippled with what looked like disgust as she took in his appearance. Average height, thin build, calloused hands from years of manual labor. To her, he probably looked like everything wrong with humanity. "Perfect," she said, standing, up to her full intimidating height. "Here we have a typical human. Look at him. Weak, small, probably never fought anything stronger than a dust bunny." Some of the aliens chuckled nervously at her joke. Jinho felt his face burning with embarrassment, but he kept his expression neutral. His grandfather had taught him long ago that showing emotion to bullies only made things worse. Better to stay calm and hope the situation would pass. But Thanica wasn't done. She stepped closer, her massive frame casting a shadow over him. "Tell me, maintenance drone," she said, using the insulting term that reduced him to nothing more than a machine. "What makes humans think they deserve to stand among real warriors in the Council? What have your people ever accomplished besides running away from fights?" The cantina fell completely silent. This wasn't just casual mockery anymore. It was a direct challenge to human honor in front of representatives from across the galaxy. Park Mina had been watching the situation unfold from her table near the communication station. As the ship's communications officer, she dealt with diplomatic messages every day and knew how quickly these kinds of incidents could spiral out of control. She could see the tension building in Thanica's posture and knew someone had to step in before things got worse. "Thanica, please," Mina said, standing up and moving toward the confrontation. Her voice carried the calm authority she used when handling difficult transmissions between hostile species. "There's really no need for this kind of—" The Vektari warrior spun toward her with lightning speed, all 4 arms spreading wide in a display of raw intimidation. Each hand was the size of a dinner plate, with fingers thick enough to bend metal. Bars. The purple scales along her arms stood up like armor plating, and her crimson eyes blazed with fury. "Silence!" Thaneka roared, her voice so loud it made the metal walls of the cantina vibrate. Several smaller aliens actually backed away from the sheer force of her anger. "This is between me and your pathetic species. Do not interfere in matters of honor." Mina felt her heart racing but forced herself to stay calm. She had dealt with angry aliens before, though never one quite this dangerous. "I understand you're upset, but surely we can resolve this through diplomatic channels rather." "Then diplomatic channels?" Thaneka laughed, a harsh sound that came from deep in her throat. "That's exactly the problem with humans. Always talking, always negotiating, never fighting. You think words make you strong, but strength only comes from battle." The crowd pressed closer, sensing that something historic was about to happen. Alien species from across the galaxy watched with fascination as the confrontation escalated. Most had never seen a human challenged to single combat by a Vektari warrior before. "I challenge this human to combat," Thaneka declared, pointing, one massive finger directly at Jinho. "Single fight honor rules, no weapons except what nature gave us. When I crush him in 30 seconds, maybe all humans will finally understand their place in this galaxy." The words hit the cantina like a physical blow. Everyone knew what a Vektari honor challenge meant. It was a formal duel that could only end with surrender or unconsciousness. There were no rules against killing, though most warriors considered it more honorable to leave their opponent alive but thoroughly defeated. Jinho stood frozen for a moment, still holding his mop. The cleaning tool suddenly seemed absurd in his hands, a symbol of everything Thaneka despised about humanity. He could feel hundreds of eyes watching him, waiting to see if he would run away like the coward she claimed all humans were. Slowly, deliberately, he set the mop down against the wall. The simple action seemed to take forever, and the entire cantina held its breath. When he straightened up, his hands were shaking slightly, but his voice was steady. "I accept," he said quietly. The cantina erupted in chaos. Aliens began talking, excitedly in dozens of different languages, their voices creating a wall of sound that echoed off the metal walls. Some looked shocked that a human maintenance worker would accept such a challenge. Others seemed excited at the prospect of witnessing a legendary Vektari warrior in action. Captain Kim Dajun had been in his quarters reviewing supply reports when the commotion started. Now he pushed through the crowd, his face grim with concern. As the ship's captain, he was responsible for the safety of everyone aboard, and this situation was rapidly spinning out of control. "Jinho, you don't have to do this," Dajun said urgently. "There are other ways to handle diplomatic incidents. We can file a complaint with the council or—" But Jinho was already shaking his head. "She challenged me directly, Captain. If I back down now, it won't just reflect on me. It'll reflect on all of us." Thaneka's mandibles clicked together in what might have been laughter or approval. The sound was unsettling, like giant insects communicating in some alien language. Finally, "A human with some spine," she said, "though spine won't help you when I start breaking your bones." She looked around the cantina, making sure everyone could hear her next words. "The arena 1 hour from now. That should give you enough time to say goodbye to your friends and write your final messages home." Her crimson eyes glittered with cruel amusement. "Oh, and bring medical supplies. You're definitely going to need them." The medical bay felt cramped with 4 people inside, but nobody wanted to leave Jinho alone right now. Song Hana moved around him with practiced efficiency, running her medical scanner over his body, while muttering under her breath about foolish maintenance workers and alien warriors. As the ship's doctor, she had patched up plenty of injuries over the years, but she had never prepared someone for what amounted to a death sentence. "Hold still," she said, pressing the scanner against his chest. The device beeped softly as it recorded his vital signs. "I need to get baseline readings, so I'll know how badly you're hurt afterward." Choi Min-soo couldn't stop pacing. The security chief was a compact man with graying hair who had served on military vessels before joining the Starwind's crew. He had seen combat, knew what real violence looked like, and that's exactly why he was so worried now. This is completely insane, Minsu said for the third time, running his hands through his hair. Do you have any idea what you're up against? The Vectari didn't become the most feared warriors in the galaxy by accident. They've conquered half the outer rim worlds through pure military might. Jinho sat on the medical table, flexing his fingers and testing his grip strength. His hands were calloused from years of maintenance work, but they felt impossibly small compared to what he would be facing. I know what they are, he said quietly. No, I don't think you do, Minsu continued, his voice rising with frustration. They're literally bred for war. Their entire culture revolves around combat. Children start fighting as soon as they can walk. Their bones are denser than ours. Their muscles are 3 times stronger, and they have 4 arms to our 2. Doctor. Hannah looked up from her scanner with a worried expression. Your stress hormones are definitely elevated, which is normal given the circumstances. But your heart rate is remarkably steady for someone about to face mortal combat. Are you in shock? Sometimes the mind protects itself by shutting down emotional responses. Through the small porthole in the medical bay, stars moved slowly past, in the endless dance of space travel. Each point of light represented a solar system, possibly with inhabited worlds where beings lived and died without ever knowing about the drama unfolding aboard one small trading vessel. Jinho found the sight somehow comforting. I'm not in shock, he said, though he wasn't entirely sure that was true. Everything felt strangely distant, like he was watching someone else's life unfold. I keep thinking about my grandfather's stories. Captain Kim Daejun, who had been quietly observing from the corner, stepped forward. What kind of stories? Jinho's eyes remained fixed on the stars outside. He used to tell me about the old country, back when our family were farmers. There were bad years when the crops failed, when there wasn't enough food, when it seemed like everything was falling apart. But they endured. They found ways to survive that seemed impossible. That's different, Minsu protested. That was about surviving hardship, not getting beaten to death by an alien warrior. Is it, though? Jinho asked, finally looking away from the porthole. My father worked 16-hour days in the fields without complaining, not because he was the strongest or the smartest, but because he refused to give up. When the farming equipment broke down, he fixed it with whatever materials he could find. When the weather was terrible, he worked anyway. Dr. Hana finished her scans and set the device aside. Your physical condition is good for someone your age, but that's not going to matter much against a Vectari. They can bench press hover cars. I know I can't match her strength, Jinho said. But maybe that's not the point. The room fell silent, except for the quiet hum of the ship's engines. Everyone was thinking the same thing, but nobody wanted to say it out loud. This was going to be a massacre, and they were all helpless to stop it. There has to be another way, Mina said from the doorway. The communications officer had been listening to the conversation while monitoring diplomatic channels, hoping for some miracle that would prevent the fight. I could send a priority message to the council, explain the circumstances. Maybe they could intervene. Jinho shook his head. By the time they respond, it'll be over one way or another. Besides, she challenged me personally. This isn't about politics anymore. He stood up from the medical table and rolled his shoulders, testing his range of motion. His body felt loose and ready, though he couldn't tell if that was confidence or resignation. My grandfather always said that sometimes enduring is all we can do. We can't control what happens to us, but we can control how we respond. The stars continued their silent journey past the porthole, indifferent to human struggles and alien challenges alike. Word had spread through the ship faster than anyone expected. What started as a confrontation in the cantina had become the most talked-about event in months. Aliens who rarely left their quarters emerged to witness something they had never seen before, a human facing a Vectari warrior in single combat. The arena wasn't large, originally designed for recreational sparring and fitness training, but today it felt like a coliseum, as beings from dozens of different worlds packed themselves against the safety barriers. The air buzzed with excitement, and the constant chatter of alien languages mixing together into an incomprehensible wall of sound. Credits changed hands rapidly as bets were placed. Most aliens were wagering on how quickly the fight would end, not who would win. 30 seconds seemed to be the popular choice, with a few optimists betting on a full minute. Nobody was putting money on the human. A group of Zentorian traders had claimed the best viewing spots, their tall, thin bodies allowing them to see over the crowd. "I've seen Vektari fights before," one of them said in heavily accented Universal. "Usually over before you can blink." "This one might last longer," another replied, adjusting his translator device. "The human looks calm. Maybe he has some secret weapon." But as Jinho entered the arena, it became clear he had no weapons at all. He wore simple grey training clothes that Dr. Hana had found in the ship's small gymnasium, loose pants and a sleeveless shirt that wouldn't restrict his movement. His feet were bare and his hands were empty. Compared to the elaborate armor and weapons most species brought to combat, he looked painfully ordinary. The crowd's noise died down as Thanica made her entrance. She moved with the fluid grace of a predator, her 8-foot frame rippling with barely contained power. Her purple scales had been polished until they gleamed like metal under the arena's harsh lighting. 4 arms swung in perfect coordination, each one thick with muscle that could crush steel pipes. She wore no armor because she didn't need any. Her natural scales provided better protection than most manufactured materials, and her bone structure was designed to absorb impacts that would shatter human skeletons. This was what millions of years of evolution had created, the perfect fighting machine. The size difference was shocking. Thanica towered over Jinho by more than 2 feet, and her mass was probably 3 times his. When she flexed her 4 arms, in a display of intimidation, every muscle group was visible beneath her scaled hide like cables of living steel. "Look at them together," whispered a Corellian diplomat in the front row. "It's like watching a child face a battle tank." The arena master, a neutral Valdorian with blue skin and 3 eyes, stood between the 2 fighters. His job was to ensure fair combat and prevent unnecessary deaths, though everyone knew his power was limited once the fighting began. "Last chance to yield, human," Thanica said, her voice carrying clearly across the arena. "I have killed creatures twice your size, in honorable combat. Your death will be quick if you surrender now." This was the moment everyone expected Jinho to back down. The smart thing, the sensible thing, would be to admit defeat and walk away with his life. No one would blame him for refusing to fight an impossible battle. Instead, Jinho did something that surprised everyone in the arena. He bowed respectfully to his opponent, a formal gesture that showed honor rather than fear. "I'm honored by your attention," he said simply. Thanica's crimson eyes narrowed with confusion. Her head tilted slightly like a predator trying to understand unexpected behavior from its prey. In all her years of combat, she had never encountered a response like this. Opponents usually begged for mercy, threatened revenge, or stood in terrified silence. They didn't bow politely and express gratitude. The crowd sensed something unusual happening. The excited chatter died down to an expectant hush as everyone strained to see what would happen next. "You are either very brave or very stupid," Thanica said finally. "Maybe both," Jinho replied with a slight smile. The arena master raised his arm, waiting for the perfect moment to begin. "Fighters ready?" Both combatants nodded. "Combat begins now." The moment combat began, Thanica moved like lightning, struck in reverse. Her massive frame exploded forward with speed that seemed impossible for something so large. 4 arms worked in perfect coordination, each fist the size of a sledgehammer cutting through the air with deadly precision. Jinho had been expecting her to be fast, but the reality was overwhelming. He threw himself sideways just as her lead. Fist smashed into the arena floor where he had been standing. The reinforced metal cracked like thin ice, sending sparks flying in all directions. The sound echoed through the arena like a thunderclap. Before he could fully recover, Thanica was already spinning toward him. Her backhand caught him across the ribs with bone-jarring force, lifting him completely off his feet. Jinho felt like he had been hit by a speeding hovercar as he tumbled across the arena floor, his body bouncing twice before rolling to a stop near the far wall. The crowd roared with excitement. This was what they had come to see, the raw, brutal power of a Vektari warrior in action. Several aliens were already checking their timepieces, expecting the fight to end within seconds. Blood filled Jinho's mouth from where he had bitten his tongue during the impact. His ribs felt like they were on fire and his vision blurred for a moment as he struggled to focus, but somehow, impossibly, he managed to roll back to his feet. His legs shook slightly, but he stayed upright. Thaneka advanced again, this time more methodically. She had expected that first hit to end the fight, and the human's resilience seemed to puzzle her. Now she brought all four arms into play, creating a whirlwind of destruction that was designed to overwhelm any opponent. The pattern was hypnotic and terrifying. Her arms moved in sequence, left high, right low, secondary, left middle, secondary, right high, creating a wall of striking surfaces that seemed impossible to escape. Each punch carried enough force to dent steel plating, and they came so fast that the air itself seemed to scream. Jinho found himself in a nightmare of motion and violence. Every strike he managed to dodge sent shockwaves through his body from the displaced air. When he tried to block, the impact nearly shattered his forearms. When he tried to counterattack, she simply overwhelmed him with more strikes from different angles. A glancing blow to his shoulder sent him spinning. Another caught his hip and sent him stumbling. A third grazed his forehead, opening a cut that immediately began bleeding into his eyes. The metallic taste of blood was constant now, and his breathing came in ragged gasps. "Stand still and die with honor," Thaneka roared, her voice carrying frustration that hadn't been there at the start. "Stop running like a coward." But Jinho couldn't stand still even if he wanted to. His body moved on pure instinct now, driven by reflexes he didn't know he possessed. He kept moving, kept breathing, kept watching for any opening or pattern he could exploit. In the crowd, his friends watched in horrified fascination. Park Mina had her hands pressed to her mouth, barely able to watch as their colleague endured what should have been a massacre. Captain Kim Daejin stood rigid with tension, his knuckles white as he gripped the barrier rail. Dr. Song Hana watched with professional detachment, mentally cataloguing the injuries she would need to treat afterward. But even she was surprised that Jinho was still conscious, let alone standing. Choi Min-soo, the security chief, found himself analyzing the combat with growing amazement. "He's not fighting her," he whispered to the others. "He's surviving her." That was exactly right. Jinho wasn't trying to win in any conventional sense. He was simply enduring, absorbing punishment that would have killed most beings, and somehow finding ways to keep going. Each time Thaneka expected him to fall, he rolled back to his feet. Each time she cornered him, he found a way to slip away. The crowd began to notice something strange happening. The fight should have been over in 30 seconds, but Jinho was still moving after 2 minutes. His face was a mask of blood and bruises, his clothes were torn, but his eyes remained clear and focused. Thaneka's attacks remained devastating, but something subtle was changing in the rhythm of combat. 3 minutes stretched into an eternity inside the arena. The crowd had expected to witness a quick execution, but instead they found themselves watching something unprecedented. Thaneka continued her relentless assault, each strike carrying enough force to crush bones, but the human somehow kept moving. The 5-minute mark, something subtle but significant was happening. Thaneka's breathing had become noticeably heavier, her massive chest rising and falling as she worked to maintain her devastating pace. Her strikes, while still incredibly powerful, had lost just a fraction of their initial speed. It was barely perceptible, but in a fight measured in milliseconds, even small changes mattered. Jinho looked terrible. His face had become a mask of blood and bruises, with one eye nearly swollen shut and cuts decorating his forehead and cheeks. His training clothes were torn in multiple places, exposing more bruises along his ribs and arms. But despite the damage, his remaining good eye stayed sharp and focused, tracking every movement his opponent made. The most remarkable change wasn't visible in his injuries, but in how he moved. At the beginning of the fight, Jinho had been purely reactive, desperately dodging and scrambling to survive each attack. Now he was doing something different. He was learning. When Thaneka favored her right-side strikes, launching powerful hooks, and crosses with her primary arms, Jinho began positioning himself slightly to her left. The adjustment was tiny, barely noticeable to most observers, but it forced her to work harder to reach him with her most devastating attacks. When she overextended on a particularly vicious combination, throwing all four arms in sequence and, leaving herself momentarily off balance, Jinho was already moving to exploit the opening. He didn't try to counterattack directly. That would have been suicide. But he used those brief moments to create distance and catch his breath. The crowd began to murmur with growing amazement. Veteran warriors from species across the galaxy found themselves leaning forward, studying the human's movement patterns with professional interest. What they were seeing shouldn't have been possible. "He's reading her," whispered a Corellian fighter who had won championships in 3 different star systems. "Look at how he moves now compared to the beginning. He's actually adapting to her fighting style." A massive overhead strike from Thaneka's secondary left arm crashed into the arena floor where Jinho had been standing just moments before. But he wasn't there anymore. He had seen the wind-up, recognized the pattern, and moved before the blow landed. "What are you?" Thaneka gasped between strikes, her voice carrying a note of confusion that hadn't been there before. In her centuries of combat experience, she had never faced an opponent who became more dangerous the longer the fight continued. Jinho ducked under a haymaker that whistled through the air where his head had been. The punch carried so much force it would have decapitated him if it had connected. But his movement was fluid now, almost graceful, as if he was dancing to music only he could hear. "Just a maintenance worker," he replied, but his voice had changed completely from the beginning of the fight. Gone was the nervous tremor and uncertainty. In its place was something harder, more focused, a quiet, burning determination that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside. The sound of his voice made several alien warriors in the crowd shift, uncomfortably. They recognized that tone even if they couldn't quite place it. It was the voice of someone who had found their center in the middle of chaos, someone who had stopped fighting the storm and learned to move with it instead. "Doctor." Hana watched from the crowd with growing amazement. "His vitals should be through the roof," she muttered to Captain Dajan. "He should be in shock or unconscious or worse. But look at him. He's getting calmer, not more panicked." Thaneka launched another combination, but this time Jinho was ready for it. He slipped the first strike, rolled under the second, and used her momentum against her as she overbalanced. For just a moment, the 8-foot warrior stumbled slightly, and the crowd gasped at the sight. It wasn't much, barely a half step. But it was the first time in the fight that Thaneka had looked anything less than completely dominant. And Jinho had caused it not through strength or speed, but through patience and observation. The human maintenance worker was becoming something else entirely, right before their eyes. 10 minutes became 15, and the atmosphere in the arena had completely transformed. What started as a bloodthirsty crowd cheering for quick violence had become something else entirely. Hundreds of beings watching in stunned silence as they witnessed something that defied everything they thought they knew about combat. The only sounds now were the harsh breathing of both fighters and the wet impact of strikes landing on flesh. Even the ship's usual background hum seemed muted, as if the entire vessel was holding its breath. Thaneka's condition had deteriorated dramatically. Her purple scales, which had gleamed like polished armor at the start, were now slick with sweat that dripped steadily onto the arena floor. Her forearms, once moving in perfect deadly coordination, now showed signs of fatigue. Her strikes were still dangerous, but they lacked the precision and overwhelming speed that had made her famous across the galaxy. More troubling for the Vectari warrior was the growing desperation in her attacks. What had begun as methodical destruction was becoming wild, almost panicked striking. She was throwing more power into each punch, but her technique was suffering. For a species that prided itself on disciplined combat excellence, this was deeply disturbing. Jinho looked like he had been through a meat grinder. Blood seeped from dozens of cuts across his face, arms, and torso. His left eye was completely swollen shut now, and dark bruises covered most of his visible skin. His breathing was labored, and he moved with the careful deliberation of someone whose body was operating far beyond its normal limits. But he kept coming. Every time Thaneka landed a hit that should have ended the fight, Jinho somehow found a way to stay on his feet. Every time she cornered him, he slipped away. Every time she thought she had finally broken him, he proved her wrong. The crowd watched in fascination as patterns became clear. Jinho wasn't just surviving randomly anymore. He was implementing a strategy that no one had ever seen before. He was using Thainka's strength and size against her, turning her advantages into weaknesses through patience and endurance. "Look, at her footwork," whispered the Corellian fighter to his companion. "She's off balance more often now. The human is forcing her to overcommit to strikes that would have killed anyone else." That's when Thainica decided to end it with her species' most feared technique. The killing grip was legendary throughout the galaxy, a four-armed grapple that used every limb to crush an opponent's torso while simultaneously cutting off their air supply. No being had ever escaped it, once fully applied. She lunged forward, all four arms spreading wide to envelop Jinho in an inescapable embrace of death. Her massive hands reached for his shoulders, ribs, and back, preparing to squeeze until his bones snapped like twigs. For a moment, it looked like the fight was finally over. Thainica's arms closed around Jinho's smaller frame, and the crowd leaned forward expecting to hear the sickening crack of breaking ribs. Instead, they witnessed something that would be talked about for generations. Jinho did something so unexpected, so completely against every survival instinct, that even the most experienced warriors in the crowd gasped in shock. With Thainica's arms tightening around him, he deliberately dislocated his own shoulder, twisting his arm in a way that allowed him to slip partially out of the killing grip. The sound of his shoulder joint separating was audible throughout the arena, a wet pop that made several aliens wince in sympathetic pain. But Jinho's face never changed expression. His good eye remained focused on Thainica, showing no sign of the agony he must have been experiencing. "Impossible," someone whispered in the crowd, their voice carrying clearly in the stunned silence. Using his dislocated arm as leverage, Jinho twisted his entire body and slipped free of the grip that had killed hundreds of opponents. He rolled, away, his useless arm hanging at an odd angle, but his legs still working to carry him to safety. Thanica staggered backward, her crimson eyes wide with disbelief. In all her centuries of combat, she had never seen anything like this. Her killing grip was supposed to be absolute, inescapable, yet somehow this small human had found a way out by injuring himself worse than she had injured him. "What kind of creature damages itself to survive?" she gasped, her voice carrying a note of fear that hadn't been there before. Jinho reached up with his good arm and grabbed his dislocated shoulder. Without hesitation, without even pausing to brace himself, he slammed it back into place with a grinding pop that echoed through the arena. His jaw clenched slightly, but his voice remained steady. "The kind that doesn't quit," he said simply. The words hung in the air like a challenge to everything the assembled aliens thought they knew about limits and pain, and what beings would do to survive. 23 minutes had passed since the arena. Master declared combat to begin. What should have been a 30-second demonstration of Vectari superiority had become something else entirely, a test of endurance that was pushing both fighters far beyond their limits. The crowd had long since stopped their excited chatter and betting. Now they watched in stunned fascination as two beings pushed themselves to the very edge of what was physically possible. The air in the arena felt thick with tension, as if everyone present understood they were witnessing something historic. Thanica had been fighting for nearly a quarter of an hour without pause, her massive frame driving forward with relentless aggression. But the signs of exhaustion were becoming impossible to ignore. Her purple scales, once gleaming with health and vitality, were now dull and slick with perspiration. Her breathing had become labored, each breath a visible effort that shook her entire body. Her four arms, which had moved with machine-like precision at the start of the fight, now trembled slightly between strikes. The coordination that made Vectari warriors so deadly was breaking down as fatigue crept into her muscles. Her strikes were still dangerous, but they came slower now, with longer pauses between combinations. Jinho looked like he had been through a war zone. Blood covered most of his visible skin, flowing from cuts on his face, arms, and torso. His training clothes were more tear than fabric at this point, hanging in tatters that revealed the extent of his injuries. His left eye remained completely swollen shut, and his breathing came in shallow gasps that suggested possible rib damage. But somehow, impossibly, he remained standing. His good eye tracked Thaneka's movements with laser focus, and his body continued to respond to his commands, even though it should have shut down from trauma and exhaustion long ago. Every time she launched an attack, he found a way to move, to slip aside, to absorb the impact and keep fighting. The moment came suddenly. Thaneka had been preparing for another combination, drawing back her primary right arm for a devastating cross-punch that would have ended the fight if it landed. But as she shifted her weight forward, something gave out. Her legs, which had been supporting her massive frame throughout the extended battle, simply couldn't take any more. The left knee buckled first, sending her stumbling sideways. She tried to catch herself, but her exhausted muscles couldn't compensate quickly enough. With a sound like a falling tree, Thaneka collapsed to one knee. Her forearms spread wide to catch her balance, but they trembled with the effort. For the first time in the fight, she looked vulnerable, not just tired, but defeated. The arena fell completely silent. Even the ship's background noise seemed to fade away as hundreds of beings processed what they were seeing. A Vektari warrior, one of the most feared fighters in the galaxy, had been brought to her knees by exhaustion while facing a human maintenance worker. Jinho stood over her, swaying, slightly but still upright. Blood dripped steadily from his numerous wounds onto the arena floor, creating a small pool at his feet. His breathing was ragged, and his body showed clear signs of severe trauma. But his spine remained straight, and his remaining good eye stayed, focused on his opponent. The silence stretched on for what felt like hours but was probably only seconds. No one seemed to know what to do next. This situation had never occurred in recorded Vektari history. Their warriors either won quickly or died trying. They didn't collapse from exhaustion. Finally, Thaneka's voice cut through the silence. It was barely above a whisper, so quiet that only the front rows could hear it clearly. But in the absolute stillness of the arena, it carried to every corner. I yield. The words hit the crowd like a physical blow. For a moment, no one reacted, as if their minds couldn't process what they had just heard. Then the arena erupted in chaos. Alien voices rose in shock, confusion, and something approaching awe. Beings from dozens of different species began talking at once, their languages mixing into an incomprehensible wall of sound. Some sounded amazed, others frightened, and a few seemed angry at having their fundamental understanding of the universe challenged. "Impossible!" someone shouted above the noise. "Vektari don't yield!" "The human won," another voice called out. "A maintenance worker defeated a Vektari warrior." Through it all, Jinho remained standing over his fallen opponent. Despite everything he had endured, despite the pain that must have been coursing through his body, he did something that surprised everyone present one final time. He extended his good hand toward Thaneka, offering to help her back to her feet. "Good fight," he said simply, his voice carrying the same quiet respect he had shown at the beginning of the combat. The arena transformed into a medical emergency zone within minutes. Dr. Song Hana rushed onto the combat floor with her emergency kit, followed by 2 medics from other ships who happened to be aboard. The crowd pressed against the barriers, everyone wanting to get a closer look at the 2 fighters who had just rewritten the rules of galactic combat. Jinho sat on a medical stretcher, his body finally allowing itself to feel the full extent of his injuries now that the adrenaline was wearing off. His face was a patchwork of cuts and bruises. His ribs were likely cracked, and his shoulder still ached from the deliberate dislocation. But he was conscious and alert, which Dr. Hana considered a minor miracle. "Hold still," she muttered, cleaning. A particularly deep cut on his forehead. "I still can't believe you're alive, let alone talking." Nearby, Thaneka received attention from a Vektari medic who had been summoned from another vessel. The massive warrior sat quietly as her wounds were tended, but her eyes remained fixed on Jinho, with an expression that was difficult to read. The crowd had settled into an expectant hush, waiting to see what would happen next. This wasn't just about a fight anymore. It was about understanding something fundamental that had shifted in the galaxy's perception of humanity. Finally, Thaneka stood up, waving away her medic's protests. She walked slowly to the center of the arena, her movements still showing the effects of exhaustion but her posture radiating dignity. When she spoke, Her voice carried clearly to every corner of the space. "I need to say something," she announced, and the crowd fell completely silent. "I have fought across 17 star systems in my lifetime. I have faced the ice warriors of Keftar, the stone giants of Moravec, the swarm fighters of the Centauri colonies. I have never been defeated in single combat." She paused, looking directly at Jinho as Dr. Hana continued her work. "Today I learned something about humans that I did not understand before. They do not win through superior strength or speed or natural weapons. They do not have claws or armor or the ability to breathe fire." A murmur ran through the crowd as beings from various species nodded in agreement. This was what most of them believed about humans, that they were physically inferior to almost every other spacefaring race. "But they have something else," Thaneka continued, her voice growing stronger. "Something that may be more dangerous than any weapon. They refuse to accept defeat. They endure things that would break the spirit of any other species. They adapt. They survive and they never give up." She gestured toward Jinho, who was trying to wave off Dr. Hana's ministrations so he could listen. This human damaged his own body to escape a killing grip that has never been broken. He fought for over 20 minutes against an opponent 3 times his size and never once considered surrender. That is not weakness. That is a strength I have never encountered before. The crowd began to understand what they had witnessed. This wasn't just about one fight between 2 individuals. This was about recognizing that humans brought something unique to the galactic community, a kind of persistent determination that could overcome seemingly impossible odds. Word of the fight began spreading through the ship's communication networks immediately. Within hours, the story had reached the galactic news services. Human defeats Vectari warrior through endurance. Maintenance worker refuses to quit. The fight that changed everything. Other species began to reconsider their assumptions about humanity. If one human could push a Vectari warrior to exhaustion, what could their entire species accomplish when working together? The implications were staggering. The next morning, Jinho reported for duty as usual. His face was covered in bandages, his left arm was in a sling, and he moved carefully to avoid aggravating his injured ribs. But he showed up with his cleaning supplies and began his rounds with the same methodical precision he had always shown. The difference was in how others treated him. When alien passengers passed him in the corridors, they nodded respectfully instead of ignoring him. Crew members from other species stopped to ask how he was feeling. Even the ship's captain began including him in briefings about diplomatic situations. "You've become something of a celebrity," Captain Kim Daejan told him during one of these meetings. "The Galactic Council has received requests from dozens of species wanting to understand human fighting techniques." Jinho just smiled and shook his head. "I'm not a fighter, Captain. I'm just someone who doesn't know when to quit." But that, as the galaxy was beginning to understand, might be the most dangerous thing of all.